Hello friends, I am glad to see you again. Today I'm going to tell you about a neighbor who thinks she owns my house, and I'm going to believe it. The day I first pulled into the driveway of my dream home, I felt an immediate rush of excitement. I had spent several years working 2 jobs and sacrificing weekends for freelance gigs just to save up enough money for a down payment. The house itself wasn't extravagant, but it was perfect for me. A modest, single-story property with a neatly fenced backyard, plenty of windows for sunlight, and a small porch where I pictured myself sipping coffee while listening to the birds. After a lifetime of renting cramped apartments in crowded parts of the city, this represented a milestone. It wasn't just a roof over my head. It was the physical embodiment of my independence. The neighborhood itself looked welcoming. Well-kept lawns, a peaceful street, and a sense of quiet pride in the community. I felt I had found my own slice of heaven. Little did I know, my peace would be shattered on the very first afternoon by someone who was about to make the strangest and most aggravating claim I've ever heard. I remember the moving truck still being halfway unloaded when a bright flash of pink from the corner of my eye caught my attention. Up the sidewalk strolled a woman with short, permed hair, sporting sunglasses perched high on her head. She wore a floral top so brightly colored that it nearly glowed under the sun. She marched with a certain air of confidence, or arrogance, depending on your perspective, and as she approached, I noticed she had an officious notepad clutched against her side. The neighborly part of me was relieved. Maybe she was coming over to say hello or offer a friendly greeting. So I put my box down, expecting a warm welcome. Before I even managed to say hello, she spoke in a curt, almost bossy voice that contrasted sharply with her cheerful top. Her first words to me: "I own this place and I need to see some identification." I let out a confused chuckle, wondering if I had heard her correctly. So many thoughts raced through my mind. Could she be from the county assessor's office, or maybe someone working with the local utility company, checking records? But then her tone turned sharper and she repeated, "Sir, this is my house. I'm the primary person who gets paid to stay here. Have you already moved in?" I was so startled that I couldn't keep up with her statements. Paid to stay here? What on earth was she talking about? When I tried to clarify, I simply stuttered, "Wait, who are you?" She answered that her name was Karen and that she had a claim to my property. According to her, this arrangement was long-standing, and any new occupant was required to pay her a fee for occupancy. She said, "This is a casual living arrangement, right? A monthly rent that goes through me, and if you don't pay, you have 24 hours to vacate. I need that money, or you'll have to pack up." I must have looked like a deer in headlights. I blinked a few times, trying to process what was happening. This was not a rental. I had just purchased the house, going through all the usual channels: real estate agent, escrow, a title company. Now this complete stranger was demanding money from me? It made no sense. I managed to blurt out, "What are you talking about? I'm the legal owner. I closed on this house last week, and all the official documents list me as the property owner." She lifted her chin, looked me square in the face, and told me, "That is incorrect. I've been the one overseeing this house for years, so if you want to stay here, you pay me." She gestured to my moving truck with a contemptuous little shake of her head. "You might want to load that back up if you're not going to do the right thing." At that point, my confusion started to shift toward anger and disbelief. The nerve of this woman. But I also felt a twinge of worry. Could there have been some real estate scam I was unaware of? Had I been duped somehow? After all, I didn't know every single detail of the house's history aside from what the official documents said. I decided to keep calm and avoid a heated argument on the sidewalk. Instead, I told her, "I'll look into that. Could I have your phone number or something so we can continue this conversation at a better time?" She scribbled a local number on the corner of her notepad, tore off the page, and handed it to me. Then, with a stiff nod, she walked back down the sidewalk. I stood there, piece of paper in hand, heart pounding. My friend Joey, who had driven the truck with me, came over and asked, "What was that about?" I shook my head, trying to brush it off. "I'm not sure. She claims to own the house, says I need to pay her." We both had a good laugh, thinking maybe this was some bizarre misunderstanding or a neighborly prank, though it seemed too weird to be a practical joke. We went back to unloading. I resolved to confirm everything that evening with my real estate agent and the title documents. I assumed once I confirmed it with them, I could show Karen the proof. I had no reason to suspect how far she'd go in insisting on her so-called rights to my home. It was later that afternoon, after I set up my living room, that I reached out to my real estate agent. I explained what had happened, and her immediate reaction was a mix of amusement and mild concern. "I've never heard of anything like that," she said. "We cleared the title. It's entirely in your name. No one else is associated with the property in any way. That gave me a sense of relief, though not entirely, because Karen's claim was so forceful and her attitude so confrontational. I asked the agent whether there could have been some old arrangement, maybe a caretaker or occupant with a life estate in the property, that hadn't appeared in official documents, but she assured me that the only occupant prior to me was the seller, who had lived there for a few years before relocating to a different state. There was no caretaker arrangement, no lease, nothing that would allow someone else to claim partial ownership. Feeling more confident, I ventured to meet some of the other neighbors. I managed to speak with a couple who lived 2 houses down, an older retired pair named Tim and Lucy. They were friendly and seemed delighted to welcome me. I carefully asked if they knew anything about a woman named Karen who lived nearby, mentioning that she had made some strange remarks about owning my house. Tim rolled his eyes in such an exaggerated manner that Lucy patted his arm to calm him. He explained that Karen lived across the street, the pink blouse lady, as Lucy quietly interjected. Tim stated that Karen had a reputation for meddling in other people's business. However, he had never heard of her claiming to own someone's house before. He said, "She's definitely unusual. She's always complaining about people's yard decorations or who's parking on the street. She once tried to force Lucy and me to tear down our porch enclosure because she said it violated some imaginary covenant. This neighborhood isn't under a homeowners association, so obviously we ignored her. It got real ugly for a while." Tim's story matched the vibe I'd gotten from Karen. Pushy, arrogant, and with a need to be in charge. Lucy then warned me that Karen was relentless when she believed she was in the right. In Lucy's words, if she wants something, she keeps pressing. She might call the city, the county, the police, anyone who'll listen. So stay on your toes. We chatted a bit more about general neighborhood happenings, and Tim gave me the name of a good local hardware store. After exchanging goodbyes, I felt both relieved to have supportive neighbors and somewhat uneasy about the future. It seemed that Karen's interference wasn't just a one-time glitch. If she was known for stirring up drama, I suspected my direct confrontation with her over a supposed ownership claim would escalate. The very next morning, the first sign of escalation emerged in a surprising form. A typed note slipped under my front door. I discovered it just as I was making coffee. The note was printed in a large, bold font. It said, "Final notice, payment for occupancy must be made immediately. You have 24 hours. No signature, no letterhead, no explanation." But the style matched Karen's threatening tone from the previous day. My head spun with questions. Did she actually think I would hand over money just because of a typed note? My name wasn't even on the paper, nor was there any official reference that a legitimate document would require. It was baffling. I decided to keep the note as evidence in case things went any further legally. At lunchtime, I heard a loud knock on my door, and there she was again, in another vividly patterned blouse, wearing those sunglasses perched on top of her head. Before I even had the chance to say hello, she barged into the conversation with, "You got my note, I assume. Have you prepared the payment?" The audacity was unreal. I calmly invited her to step away from the threshold and speak to me on the porch. I refused to let her inside. She frowned at me but followed. Once we were on the porch, I addressed her claims head-on. "Look, Karen, I have the paperwork that shows I'm the legal owner. I bought this place outright. There's no lease, no arrangement, no caretaker position, nothing. It's not in a homeowners association either, so there's no forced membership or dues. I don't owe you or anyone else a dime, so I'd appreciate it if you stopped with these demands." Karen sniffed and said, "I don't believe your story. I've been paid for years to maintain this home. The old owner did it, and everyone before him. Maybe they just forgot to tell you, but it's definitely in the contract somewhere." She attempted a smug smile that did nothing but tighten the pit in my stomach. It was like talking to someone living in a parallel universe. I insisted, "That's impossible. I've read every page of the contract." She gave a dismissive wave of her hand, exclaiming, "Then your contract is incomplete." At that moment, I couldn't help the frustration welling up inside me. However, letting anger take control wasn't going to help. Instead, I tried a different approach. "If you truly believe you have some legal right to my home, then you can send me your documentation or have your attorney contact me. If you have no real proof, you need to stay off my property. Is that clear?" She lifted her eyebrows in feigned innocence and retorted, "Oh, I'll get you proof. And when I do, you'll have back payments to settle. We're talking thousands of dollars. You have until the end of the day tomorrow." Then she turned and stomped off. As soon as she was gone, I shut my door and felt my adrenaline surging. All I wanted was a quiet place to call home. This was starting to feel like a bizarre hostage situation. The next logical step, I decided, was to head down to the county clerk's office that afternoon to verify my deed. I knew everything would be in order, but I wanted official copies in my hands, stamped and certified. If Karen decided to push matters legally, I'd be prepared. Sure enough, at the clerk's office, I was able to obtain the official deed with the stamp confirming the property's transfer to me. I also had a quick conversation with a clerk there, who assured me that if someone else claimed a property that was clearly documented as mine, I would have every legal remedy to stop them. They even recommended an attorney who specialized in real estate disputes if it came to that. When I returned home with my new certified copies, I found a second note under my door, this time taped, presumably to keep it from sliding away. Again, it was in the same large, bold font, demanding that I remit payment in the form of a cashier's check made out to Karen, with an extremely suspicious post office box listed as the mailing address. My name was incorrectly spelled, by the way. She had apparently guessed how to spell my first name. The note concluded with a threat that if I failed to pay, I'd be subject to all available legal actions, including eviction. I let out an incredulous laugh. Eviction? That was impossible under these circumstances. But the gall of this woman was off the charts. I called the real estate attorney recommended by the clerk's office. I explained the situation in detail. The attorney sounded both bemused and a bit concerned, telling me that although the claims were nonsense, some individuals will continue pushing boundaries until they're met with concrete legal consequences. We discussed the possibility of sending Karen a cease and desist letter. The attorney was confident that with my paperwork, I had nothing to fear, but also warned me that if Karen tried something beyond notes, like trespassing or attempting to commandeer my property, I should be prepared to involve law enforcement. That night, as I was unpacking boxes in my bedroom, I noticed the sensor lights in the backyard flick on. My heart skipped a beat. The lights only turn on if there's movement out there. I crept to the window and peered outside. There, in the beam of the motion-activated lights, was Karen. She was walking along the fence line, apparently inspecting it. She had a small flashlight in her hand, and every so often she'd stop and look over the fence into my yard. The audacity left me speechless again. I opened the window slightly and asked, "Karen, what are you doing on my property?" She craned her neck up, startled to see me. Instead of apologizing or retreating, she put on a defiant expression. "I'm checking for damage. You obviously haven't been maintaining this fence properly. You know, this is all going on your invoice." Then she stomped off, presumably back to her own yard. I was officially creeped out. The next day, I installed cameras around my home. I wasn't sure how far Karen would go, but her boundary pushing was alarming. I wasn't going to catch her rummaging through my backyard unawares. I chose cameras that recorded to a local hard drive and also uploaded to a secure online account, just in case anything went missing. Setting them up on each side of the house took me most of the morning, but it provided a sense of security. If Karen did anything else suspicious, I'd have proof. Sure enough, that evening, the motion alerts triggered again. I watched the live feed on my phone. There she was, shining her flashlight over my fence. This time, she seemed to be photographing my backyard. I observed quietly, capturing every second of it on video. She never once tried to come into the backyard, but she was clearly up to something. Now I had direct evidence of her lurking around and attempting to intimidate me. The next day, I called my attorney and explained the situation. He suggested that I call the police non-emergency line to at least have a record that this was happening. So I did. An officer came by, listened to my story, and asked a few questions. He also watched the short video clip I had. The officer recommended politely that I ask her not to trespass, and said if she violated that request, I could potentially file trespassing charges. But as she was in her own yard at that moment, the best I could do was log the incident and remain vigilant. Still, it helped me feel less alone. I had started to wonder if I was overreacting, so hearing from law enforcement that this was indeed out of line reassured me. Over the next week, her harassment intensified in different ways. Every evening I found new pieces of paper taped to my door. These notes spanned a range of accusations: failing to maintain the property to her standards, ignoring her rightful claim to the house, and lacking the decency to pay her. One note even demanded a penalty fee for late rent. She was apparently raising the stake. The bizarre nature of these messages became almost comical. but they also gnawed at me, reminding me that she was determined to harass me until she got some reaction. I kept collecting every single note to compile a record. During that same period, I struck up more conversations with neighbors, hoping to get the full story on Karen. A man named Everett, who lived next door to her, described an incident from a few years prior in which Karen insisted that Everett's fence was encroaching onto her property by several inches. She threatened lawsuits and demanded that Everett relocate the fence. Everett spent money hiring a land surveyor just to prove that his fence was exactly on his property line. When the results came back in his favor, Karen refused to accept it. She scowled at him for months, complaining about everything from the color of his garden shed to the type of plants he grew. Everett believed that she thrived on conflict, as if stirring up drama gave her a sense of control or importance. Several neighbors echoed similar observations. Some simply ignored her, while others found themselves drawn into her bizarre allegations. More than a few had gone to the police over it, but she was cunning. She rarely crossed an explicit legal boundary. She specialized in psychological pressure, intimidation, and nuisance tactics that were hard to prosecute. My situation, however, was different. Claiming that she owned my entire house was well beyond her usual scope of yard controversies or property line disputes. I had to wonder if something was going on in her life that made her desperate for money, or maybe she was bored. Either way, I decided to stand firm and not give her the reaction she wanted. Instead, I meticulously documented everything. I recorded her nightly fence prowls, took pictures of her notes, wrote down the times and dates she confronted me, and kept my attorney updated. After 2 weeks of near-constant aggravation, the attorney and I agreed that a cease and desist letter would be a logical step. With all my evidence, we prepared a letter demanding that Karen immediately stop harassing me, stop claiming ownership of my property, and cease any attempts to collect money from me. We had it served via certified mail and also posted a copy on her door through a process server, so it was legally recognized. I held my breath, wondering how she'd react. She reacted that very evening, pounding on my door with the ferocity of someone who'd lost their mind. This time, I didn't open it. I spoke to her through the doorbell camera's intercom, telling her, "Karen, I'm asking you once again to leave my property. I've served you with a cease and desist. Any further attempts at harassment will be documented." She shouted something incoherent about me not knowing who I'm dealing with, and then stomped back to her house. The next day, I found a new note on my door, of course. This one was short and handwritten. "You'll regret crossing me." That crossed a line into a thinly veiled threat. I immediately took that note to the police. The officer I spoke with at the station took it more seriously than I expected. He said, "This sounds like criminal harassment. We can go have a word with her." I handed over copies of everything I had. The typed threats, the ownership demands, the video footage of her prowling around my yard. The officer commended me for being so organized and told me that they'd dispatch someone to speak with her that evening. That gave me some sense of relief. At least now it wasn't just my word against hers. Later that night, I saw a police cruiser parked outside Karen's house. I watched discreetly as 2 officers spoke to her on her front porch for about 15 minutes. I couldn't hear much, but her body language was extremely agitated. She threw up her hands, paced back and forth, and pointed toward my house several times. Eventually, she retreated inside and shut the door. The police left, and I finally began to think maybe she'd calm down. For the next couple of days, things were quiet. No notes, no prowling, no obnoxious demands. I even started to relax, thinking perhaps the police warning had knocked some sense into her. Unfortunately, my optimism was short-lived. On the 4th day after the police visit, I woke up early to find that someone had spray-painted "thief" on my driveway in large letters. I also noticed that my mailbox had been knocked off its post. I didn't witness who did it, but I had strong suspicions. I checked the cameras. Sure enough, at around 2 a.m., Karen had crept over to my property wearing dark clothes, a hood pulled up around her face. She was somewhat recognizable by her silhouette and distinct figure. The camera didn't show her face perfectly, but it was clear enough. She was holding a spray can, applying paint in big letters across the concrete. Then she violently kicked at my mailbox post until it gave way. The entire act was done methodically, and she seemed almost proud when she walked away. Fuming, I called the police once again and showed them the new footage. This time, it wasn't just harassment or intangible threats. This was vandalism and property damage. The officer assigned to my case told me that they'd take a formal report and likely bring charges against her. This was exactly the evidence needed to show she was a danger to me and my property. Later that day, I received a phone call from a detective who had reviewed the video. He indicated there was enough evidence to press charges for vandalism and trespassing. He asked if I wanted to press charges, and I didn't hesitate. Absolutely, yes. This crossed every possible line. Karen was served with a summons to appear in court for misdemeanor vandalism charges. Additionally, my attorney filed for a restraining order on my behalf. The judge granted a temporary protective order, ensuring that Karen was prohibited from coming within a certain distance of my home or contacting me in any form beyond official legal channels. I'd already replaced my mailbox and spent hours scrubbing my driveway. Unfortunately, some faint stains remained, but I was determined to remove every last trace of her graffiti. The day after she received the summons, Karen left me a voicemail, apparently ignoring the terms of the protective order, sobbing and insisting that she was just trying to protect her interests. She refused to admit fault, but her voice sounded desperate. I turned that voicemail over to the police as well. In the lead-up to the court date, rumors swirled around the neighborhood. Tim and Lucy told me that Karen had been ranting about me to anyone who would listen. She kept saying something along the lines of, "He's trying to steal what's mine, and I'll show him when the judge sees my paperwork." But to my knowledge, she had no real paperwork. She'd never shown me anything that even remotely suggested she had a legal interest in my property. Meanwhile, I prepared meticulously with my attorney, compiling every piece of documentation: the harassing notes, the video footage, the police reports, the witness statements from neighbors who'd seen her lurking around my yard. The attorney even contacted the previous owner of my house, who gave a sworn statement that he had no arrangement with Karen, nor had she ever been employed or authorized to represent or maintain the property. The day of Karen's misdemeanor vandalism hearing arrived. My attorney accompanied me to the courthouse. Karen arrived without any legal counsel, which caught me by surprise, given how serious her allegations had been. She seemed to be in a foul mood, scowling at everyone. The hearing itself was fairly straightforward. The prosecutor laid out the evidence of her vandalism, played the camera footage, and introduced the typed and handwritten threats as supporting evidence that she had escalated a campaign of harassment into outright property damage. Karen attempted to interrupt repeatedly, insisting that the house was her responsibility and that I was illegally occupying it. The judge shut her down, explaining that this was a hearing about her criminal vandalism charges, not a civil property dispute. If she truly believed she owned the house, she was advised to hire a civil attorney and file the appropriate suit. The judge also informed her that nothing in the official land records suggested any partial ownership on her part. She had no legal standing. At that point, she fell silent, seemingly flustered. The judge ruled that the evidence clearly showed Karen had vandalized my property and that there was no valid reason for her actions. She was found guilty of misdemeanor vandalism. While the punishment wasn't extreme, she received probation, community service hours, and a requirement to pay restitution for damages to my driveway and mailbox. It was a formal recognition that her behavior was criminal. The judge also extended my restraining order for a year, which severely limited her ability to contact me or come near my property. Leaving the courthouse, I finally felt some sense of victory. However, I suspected Karen wouldn't let it go. She had been humiliated in court after all. Over the next few days, I kept my cameras rolling and remained on alert. She avoided me entirely, though. At times, I saw her looking out from her window, glaring at my house, but she never came onto my property. She stopped leaving notes. She stopped shouting demands about rent or ownership. But there was a lingering tension. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was just waiting for an opportunity to stir the pot again. One evening, about a month after the court hearing, Tim and Lucy came by to chat. They told me that Karen was apparently contacting random people in the neighborhood, inviting them to sign some kind of petition that alleged I had obtained my house illegally. She claimed she would redeem her rightful ownership if enough neighbors backed her up. Not only did Tim and Lucy refuse to sign, but they thought the entire scenario was absurd. They warned me about it, but I figured, given her track record, nobody would take her seriously. I was right. Not a single person joined her crusade, and some neighbors even told me they felt concerned for her mental health. Though my attorney and the county clerk's office advised me not to worry too much about further legal action from Karen, I was still on edge. The tension finally erupted into a bizarre second confrontation one Saturday afternoon. I was washing my car in the driveway when Karen came rushing out of her front door. She marched across the street, stopping at the boundary of my property. She was apparently mindful of the restraining order's distance requirement. From several feet away, she yelled something about unjust systems, blind judges, and my theft of her livelihood. I just stared at her, stunned. This was the first time in weeks she had dared to approach me directly. She seemed unhinged. I pulled out my phone and started recording video as discreetly as I could. She recognized what I was doing and spat on the ground in frustration. "Sure, record me. Record an innocent woman fighting for what's hers." She then turned around, muttering loudly to herself, and retreated to her porch, slamming her door behind her. I sent that video clip to my attorney, who advised me to hold on to it in case she tried to start a civil lawsuit. However, no civil lawsuit materialized. In fact, the next thing I heard was that Karen had put her house on the market. Tim told me the rumor that she was leaving the neighborhood altogether. I was astonished that she'd go so far as to move, but I suppose having to deal with probation, community service, and the hostility of neighbors who'd lost any remaining sympathy must have been too much. A for sale sign indeed popped up on her lawn not long after. The day the sign went up, I received a letter in the mail from Karen. It wasn't typed. It looked handwritten in a more controlled, calmer style than her earlier rants. She stated that she was leaving the neighborhood because she couldn't endure living next to someone so morally bankrupt. She claimed that one day the truth would come out, and that I would be exposed as a fraudulent homeowner. She ended the letter with a curt, "May you find peace in your ill-gotten gains." It was such a bizarre parting shot that I almost laughed out loud. I turned that letter over to my attorney as well, just in case, but we both sensed that with her leaving the neighborhood, her power to harass me would be effectively gone. I've never heard from Karen again. Occasionally, I wonder if she tried to pull a similar trick in her new neighborhood. I hope she learned some lesson, but I can't say I'm optimistic. Wherever she is, I imagine her still trying to convince someone of some outrageous claim. As for me, I've fully settled into my home, forging friendships with neighbors and enjoying the peaceful life I envisioned when I first bought the property. Sometimes I still see a faint discoloration on my driveway where the word thief was once spray painted, and it reminds me of how bizarre and terrifying that conflict was. I also keep a file in my desk drawer filled with all the documents, pictures, and videos from that time. Friends, thank you. See you soon.